The Lord of the Rings. What can I say about it that hasn't already been said by hundreds of literary scholars and dozens upon dozens of fans? Written by J.R.R. Tolkien and published between 1954 and 1955, The Lord of the Rings shockingly received a mixed welcome upon its first publication, and only later gaining a dedicated following in the years after the trilogy's first release. It's been almost 70 years since The Fellowship of the Ring hit bookshelves, and in all that time, Tolkien's masterpiece has only grown in its popularity. From books to movies to video games to music, the world of Middle-earth has influenced every facet of modern pop culture you can think of. Which brings me to my question, and the main topic of this video: what is it about Middle-earth that has cast such a spell over audiences of all ages and backgrounds from all over the world? I find the question to be both not that easy to answer and very fascinating. In our current age of film and social media, we have Peter Jackson to thank for realizing the books in a way that introduces the generations raised with a phone than with a book to Tolkien's world, having adapted the trilogy into 3 movies released in the early 2000s to resounding critical acclaim from both fans of the books and film critics alike. But if we push further back than that, before the movies were released, and right before the internet took over our lives, we find ourselves in a world where it was still very common to read a book in your free time, or simply for the pleasure of it. It's in this era that the question of The Lord of the Rings' popularity becomes more interesting. You see, Tolkien is not what you would call light reading. His books aren't the kind of material you'd find in a doctor's office or on a coffee table in a business suite. You'd be more likely to find The Lord of the Rings next to a copy of John Milton's Paradise Lost and Dante's Divine Comedy, the kind of books you'd be required to read for your English Lit class. The Lord of the Rings is that dense. Casual readers would fall asleep after the first page, and even seasoned and more serious literary buffs sometimes have a hard time getting through Tolkien's narration on the battle at Helm's Deep and Frodo and Sam's slog through the wastes of Mordor. But the very fact that Tolkien wrote the trilogy the way that he did may have actually contributed to the story's success. In my view, Tolkien was the first author to create what would become standard in every fantasy sci-fi story ever to exist: the faux history. Now it's true, authors before Tolkien dabbled in primitive ideas of an alternate history for Earth, or a hidden history that has yet to be discovered. Seeds of these ideas can be seen in old stories and mythologies Tolkien took for inspiration, such as the Arthurian legends, Nordic and Greek mythology, and so on. But it was Tolkien who wrote the Middle-earth legendarium with the seriousness and attention to detail in every aspect of his world that made you believe the events of The Lord of the Rings actually happened. The trilogy reads like a world history text in many places, especially in the appendices at the end of The Return of the King and in the prequel book, The Silmarillion, regarded as the Bible of Middle-earth. Filled with literal genealogies of many of the main cast, material on how to learn Elvish, Orcish, Rohirric, and even the Black Speech, and pages upon pages of songs and poems scattered all over all 3 books, The Lord of the Rings sucks you into believing that Earth was once called Middle-earth, and that dragons really dominated the skies, and angelic beings disguised as wizards roamed the land, dealing out wisdom and protection to the free peoples of the world. Even Tolkien himself wrote in the story that the contents of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit were contained in an ancient manuscript called the Red Book of Westmark, written by both Bilbo and Frodo, and found by chance by Tolkien himself, who took it upon himself to translate the stories found in the book into modern English, thus producing the books we now know as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The fact that Tolkien wrote the story as if it were an actual account of a lost history of the world was something that had never been done on a scale this large before in the history of literary fiction. Up until that point in time, fantasy and its related categories were two-dimensional at best, simple summations at worst, and thus were never taken seriously by the public at large. By creating such a vast and deep world, Tolkien gave his audience far more than a simple surface-level fantasy story about magic rings, wizards, and elves. He gave his audience a story they could lose themselves in, and because the legendarium is so large, there's a little something for just about everyone, spanning so many different literary genres in one story. Poetry, linguistic study, world history, geography, political intrigue, religious literature, and of course, mythology and fantasy. But that seems to be too simple of an answer as to why Middle-earth has seeped so deeply into the imaginations of its readers. Therefore, we must look at the answer the way we look at Middle-earth itself. It has many parts to its one answer. Apart from the immersive world and lore, Tolkien in a sense reinvented the wheel when it came to high fantasy, and the many beasts and races found in it. Usually if we say someone reinvented the wheel, it's with the idea that the person in question took an already existing concept and tried to pass it off as something he created by putting his own style into it. For many, this idea very rarely finds success, but Tolkien was one of those few exceptions. The icons of fantasy, elves, wizards, dwarves, dragons, magic rings, and the like, were not new ideas from Tolkien. These and more were already well established in literature and in the imaginations of those familiar with bedtime stories and Shakespearean plays. The problem was, to Tolkien at least, what passed for elves and dwarves during his time were little more than garden decorations with pointed hats, white beards, and little pixies with insect wings who mistakenly gave love potions to unwitting humans. Dragons were dumb brutes who lived in wells and ate maidens as sacrifices. Much like the noble Tuatha Danann, who were once the supernatural rulers of Ireland, having been, over the long years of history rewritten, reduced to diminutive 1-foot-tall leprechauns, so too were the races and worlds of Nordic, Germanic, and Celtic mythology reduced to the little mischief makers of A Midsummer Night's Dream, a toy shop in the North Pole, little men digging for diamonds in a mine, and overgrown lizards who could be easily conquered by a simple knight with a sword. The inhabitants and lands of Middle-earth were none of these, but the resurrected Alfar of Germany, beautiful beyond mortal imagination. The dwarves, the incarnation of the dwarves also of German mythology, skilled craftsmen of stone and metal, and even the possible half-brothers of the Alfar themselves. The dragons, the old beasts who imparted wisdom on the brave and controlled the elements of the world. Tolkien went against the grain of what was considered mainstream fantasy at the time, going back to the roots and origins of fantasy itself, and plucking many of the old and original incarnations of fantasy and mythology and bringing it front and center into the modern age. Many, if not most of Tolkien's audience weren't familiar with the more serious and less whimsical interpretation of their bedtime stories and fairy tales. The idea that elves were tall, beautiful as angels, and had not one, but two different languages, and that wizards were more than mere old men in pointed hats and carrying staffs, was largely new to audiences, and the reinterpretation of mythology in Middle-earth set the course for a literal reimagining of fantasy, and what is considered standard fantasy fare in modern pop culture to this very day. The fact that The Lord of the Rings has so radically changed audiences' perception of what fantasy is and what it can be is another cause for the trilogy's long-lasting claim to fame and continued love in modern times. Much like how the influence of the Star Wars franchise can be seen in nearly every piece of modern sci-fi media, so the influence of The Lord of the Rings can be felt in every fantasy story, movie, and video game. The influences of Tolkien's legendarium is long and far-reaching, and many things that you may not think have much of a connection to Middle-earth may very well have been inspired by it. But that's another tale for another video. This has been Maddox Works, and I'll catch y'all next time.